The Zuiderzee Works are a man-made system of dams and dikes, land reclamation and water drainage works. In total the largest hydraulic engineering project undertaken by the Netherlands during the 20th century. The project involved the damming of the Zuiderzee, a large, shallow inlet of the North Sea, and the reclamation of land in the newly enclosed water using polders. Its main purposes are to improve flood protection and create additional land for agriculture. The American Society of Civil Engineers declared these works, together with the Delta Works in the southwest of the Netherlands, as among the 7 wonders of the modern world. Background: the concept of making the Zuiderzee docile originated in the 17th century. The ambitious solutions suggested were impractical given the technology then available. Plans were developed during the second half of the 19th century to protect areas from the force of the open sea and creating new agricultural land. Cornelis Lely was an ardent supporter, an engineer and later government minister. His 1891 plan was the basis for the development of what were to become the Zuiderzee Works. It consisted of a large dam connecting the northern tip of North Holland with the western coast of Friesland and the creation of initially 4 polders in the northwest, the northeast, southeast, and southwest of what would be renamed the IJsselmeer. 2 major lanes of open water were defined for shipping and drainage. The initial body of water affected by the project was 3,500 square kilometers. Opposition came from fishermen along the Zuiderzee who would lose their livelihood, and from others in coastal areas along the more northerly Wadden Sea. They feared higher water levels as a result of the closure. Other critics doubted whether the project was feasible financially. When Lely became Minister of Transport and Public Works in 1913, he used his position to promote the Zuiderzee Works and gained support. The government started developing official plans to enclose the Zuiderzee. On January 13 and 14, 1916, the dikes at several places along the Zuiderzee broke under the stress of a winter storm, and the land behind them flooded, as had often happened in previous centuries. This flooding provided the decisive impetus to implement the existing plans to tame the Zuiderzee. In addition, a threatening food shortage during the other stresses of World War I added to widespread support for the project. On June 14, 1918, the Zuiderzee Act was passed. The goals of the Act were threefold: protect the central Netherlands from the effects of the North Sea, increase the Dutch food supply by development and cultivation of new agricultural land, and improve water management by creating a lake from the former uncontrolled saltwater inlet. The Dienst der Zuiderzee Werken, the government body responsible for overseeing the construction and initial management, was set up in May 1919. It decided against building the main dam first, proceeding to construct a smaller dam, the Amsteldiepdijk, across the Amsteldiep. This was the first step in rejoining the island of Wieringen to the North Holland mainland. The dike, with a length of 2.5 kilometers, was built between 1920 and 1924. As with dike buildings, polder construction was tested on a small scale at the experimental polder at Andijk. Construction phase. Afsluitdijk, a new study, commissioned after doubts arose over the financial feasibility of the project, recommended that work should continue and be accelerated. The Zuiderzee Works Department initiated the next 2 major projects at the same time, in 1927. The most important of these was the main dam, the Afsluitdijk, running from Den Oever on Wieringen to the village of Zurich in Friesland. It was to be 32 kilometers long and 90 meters wide, rising to 7.25 meters above sea level, with an incline of 25% on each side. Experience showed that tile, rather than just sand or clay, was the best primary material for a structure like the Afsluitdijk. An added benefit was that it was easily available. It could be retrieved in large quantities by dredging it from the bottom of the Zuiderzee. Work started at 4 points on both sides of the mainland and on 2 purpose-made construction islands along the line of the future dam. From these points the dam was expanded as ships deposited till into the open sea in two parallel lines. Sand was poured between the two dams. As the fill emerged above the surface of the water, it was covered by another layer of till. The nascent dam was strengthened with basalt rocks and mats of willow switch at its base. The dam was finished by raising it with sand and finally clay for the upper surface of the dam, which was planted with grass. Construction progressed better than expected. At 3 points along the line of the dam were deeper underwater trenches, where the tidal current was much stronger than elsewhere. These had been considered major obstacles to completing the dam, but proved not to be so. On May 28, 1932, 2 years earlier than forecast, the Zuiderzee was closed when the last tidal trench of the Vlieter was filled with a bucket of till. The IJsselmeer was born, though the lake still contained salt water at the time. The dam was not finished. It still needed to be brought up to its full height, and a road linking Friesland and North Holland remained to be built. In addition to completing the dam, work needed was construction of shipping locks and discharge sluices at the ends of the dam. The complex at Den Oever includes the Steven Lock and 3 series of 5 sluices for discharging the IJsselmeer into the Wadden Sea. The other complex at Kornverditzand is composed of the Lawrence locks and 2 series of 5 sluices, making a total of 25 discharge sluices. Periodically discharging the lake is necessary since it is continually fed by rivers and streams and polders draining excess water into the IJsselmeer. The Afsluitdijk was opened September 25, 1933, with a monument marking the spot where the dam was finished. It used 23 million m³ of sand and 13.5 million m³ of till. An average of 4,000 to 5,000 workers were employed in the dam's construction, relieving unemployment during the Great Depression. Total cost of the dam was about €700 million. Land reclamation. After damming off the sea, the next step involved creating new land, known as polders. This was achieved by damming off portions of the IJsselmeer, and then pumping all the water out. The first polder, Wieringermeer, was dammed in 1929 and fully drained in 1930. The third, the Noordoostpolder, was not fully drained until 1942. It was an area much used by the Dutch underground resistance during World War II, as the fresh polder offered numerous hiding places. After the war, work was started on draining the Flevoland, a massive project totaling almost 1,000 square kilometers. This area is now home to Lelystad and Almere. The latter is the fastest growing city in the Netherlands. Another large polder was originally planned in the Markermeer. This project was extensively debated until plans were abandoned in the early 2000s, as environmental issues were viewed differently than in the 1920s. A new province, Flevoland, was created out of the Noordoostpolder and the Flevolands in 1986, thereby completing the works. This new land led to an identity change for towns including Lemmer, Valenhove, Blokzijl, the former islands of Urk and Schurkland, Wieringen and others. Kuenra suffered particularly because it was cut off from open water. The other major project started in 1927 was the construction of the 200 square kilometers polder in the northwest, the first and the smallest of the 5 projected polders. It replaced the Wieringermeer, the body of water south of Wieringen, and also the name of the new polder. It was the only polder reclaimed from the Zuiderzee itself, but it wasn't entirely the first. A small test polder of some 0.4 square kilometers was constructed in 1926–1927 near Andijk in North Holland to research the effects drainage would have on the soil of the Zuiderzee and how best to configure the new polders. Building the encircling dike for the Wieringermeer was harder than it was for the later polders, because the Wieringermeer dikes were built before the completion of the Afsluitdijk. That meant the tidal currents of the Zuiderzee were still present. As a consequence, they were somewhat higher. Construction started on the 18 kilometres dike from Den Oever on Wieringen, and the new construction island of Ouderzeugen progressed satisfactorily. The Wieringermeer was closed off from the Zuiderzee in July 1929. The next step was draining all the water from the future polder. Drainage of a polder is performed by a pumping station or mill. Two were built for the Wieringermeer: the Leemans, a diesel-powered station near Den Oever, and the Lely, an electrically powered one near Medemblik. Different power systems were used in the stations as a safety mechanism. If one station lost power, the other one would still be able to keep the polder dry. The pumping mechanism itself was based on a variation of the Archimedes screw, as designed by A. Baldwin Wood. The stations, completed in February 1930, managed to drain the polder after 6 months of continuous pumping. Drained, in this context, does not mean the land was wholly dry. Extensive pools of shallow water still littered the muddy landscape. To make the soil usable, it had to be further drained by a network of drainage canals. Small ditches were dug leading to larger watercourses, which in turn transported their water to the main drainage canals. These canals, dredged when the polder was still filled with water, conducted surplus water to the pumping stations. The resulting dehydration caused the former seabed to sink by over a meter in some places. Once the ground had settled, the smaller ditches were replaced with underground drainage tubes, which would be used for the normal drainage of the polder. With the hydrological infrastructure in place, the virgin land was developed to prepare for its later cultivation. The first plant to establish itself, though more so in the later polders than in the Wieringermeer, was reed, sown from the air by plane onto the muddy flats while the polder was still being drained. This sturdy plant helped evaporate the water and bring air into the soil, thereby solidifying its structure and further preventing the emergence of unwanted weeds. After the first infrastructure was put in place, the reed was burnt and replaced by rapeseed, turning the newborn polder into a yellow sea of flowers in spring. These crops were succeeded by various grains. In the Wieringermeer the first was rye, but the later polders plant wheat, then barley, and finally oats. This process took years, but once finished allowed planting other crops. At the same time, other infrastructure such as roads and housing were built. The Wieringermeer, as the first of the envisioned 5 polders, served as a major testbed for ideas and techniques for the following projects. It is closest to the original concept of the new land being primarily used as agricultural land, and it has retained a strong rural character. 4 villages eventually were formed in the polder: Sluitorp, Middenmeer, Wieringerwerf, and Kruilaord. Local governance presented a new problem. The area was divided among the mainland municipalities according to the boundaries used when it was water-covered. This configuration was not always practical on the ground and unnecessarily split responsibilities among several bodies. The first solution was a form of government called an openbaarlijk or public body, a complicated arrangement which incorporated both the government body in charge of the actual development and an appointed committee responsible for public governance. As the polder became more populated, the demand for representation increased until finally on July 1, 1941, the municipality of Wieringermeer was established. In the closing days of World War II, the Nazis detonated explosives severely damaging the Wieringermeer dike. No casualties were incurred, but the polder sank, and the high water and a subsequent storm destroyed most of the infrastructure built in the previous decade. Reconstruction followed quickly, and by the end of 1945 the polder was declared drained again, and rebuilding the roads, bridges, houses and farms was greatly facilitated by the experience of building them the first time. Polder. The original 1891 plan called for the largest, southeastern polder to be built after the Wieringermeer, but it was decided in 1932 to give precedence to the northeastern one, which was smaller and therefore considered easier. This would be the Polder. Due to initial financial difficulties, construction did not begin until 1936. Two dikes, totaling 55 kilometers in length, steadily grew in the IJsselmeer, one from Lemmer in Friesland to the island of Urk, the other from Valenhoven in Overijssel to Urk. Construction of these dikes and the necessary pumping stations was disrupted during World War II during the 1940 German conquest of the Netherlands. The encircling dikes were both closed in December 1940, and the pumping stations started draining in early 1941. The Polder was considered to be sufficiently drained in September 1942, and the developmental process was started for the 480 square kilometers of new land. The task of building the Polder was eased by the earlier experience, the now placid waters of the IJsselmeer, and the mechanization of the construction process. Machines, sometimes made specifically for the Zuiderzee Works, were increasingly used for this and the final polders. Land usage was much the same as in the Wieringermeer, again focusing on farming. Less fertile areas were designated to be planted as forest land. Land in the polders was state-owned during the entire developmental process. Several years after this was completed, the various plots were distributed among private parties, with priority given to the early pioneers who had been in the polder since the start. Later, farmers from all over the Netherlands became eligible for the remainder. Candidates were put through a selection process before receiving their own pieces of new land. The North Sea flood of 1953 made the government change its priorities. Instead of granting the new land only to farmers selected for their skill, the government granted land to a large number of farmers from the flooded province of Zeeland. The polder contains two former islands, the glacial moraine hill of Urk, and the elongated strip of peaceland known as Schurkland, largely abandoned in the 19th century. Urk was then and is still today a fishing community, and it served as a natural construction island for both dikes as well as a base of operations for the later exploitation of the polder. Both ceased to be islands. Urk on October 3, 1939, when the dike reaching from Lemmer was closed, and Schurkland when the surrounding water was consequently drained. Both islands stand out in the new land, physically and figuratively. The community of Urk in particular has remained an entity somewhat distinct from the mainland. It is a separate municipality from the rest of the polder, which was organized as the municipality of Polder in 1962. The town of Kuenra was cut off from the open water, losing businesses and status. At the heart of the Polder, where the three main drainage canals intersect, is the town of Emmeloord. Planned to be the first and the only major town of the polder, it serves as the local governmental and services center. 10 smaller villages, conceived more as agricultural communities, were planned in a wide circle around Emmeloord, at a distance chosen to be easily covered by bicycle. The first settlements were Jens, Markness and Kragenberg, followed by Lartelgeest, Bant, then Krael and Rutten, and finally Espel, Tollebeek, and Nagala. From Emmeloord, 3 canals carry their water to 3 pumping stations, the Boomer near Lemmer, the Smeenge at Valenhoven, and finally the Viesering in Urk. The first 2 are electrically powered, while the latter one has diesel power. Like all pumping stations of the Zuiderzee Works, they are named for individuals who made significant contributions to the project.